Hi, everybody. Today we are focused on the concept of privilege and how history has been used in the past and how the telling of history today gets used to create this concept of privilege, right? The theory is that when you don't tell the truth in history or you don't tell all the truths of history, you have a perspective of history that gets used by people like politicians, to create this concept of privilege that will get reinforced in society. So, what do I want us to do? I want us to flip the story. I want us to tell a different story or the truths that often don't get told in history, right? And I'm going to use the story of Thomas Jefferson. Why Thomas Jefferson? Because our third president story has been told numerous times. You've heard it pre-K, you've heard it in kindergarten, you've heard it all the way through your high school career, right? And I know from a Black history perspective, you're looking at this picture on the right and you're like, oh my gosh, how can this man, this father of the Declaration of Independence, this man write the words, all men are created equal, and own 600 slaves? And I'm going to tell you that his story is a classic American hypocrisy. And it does not make sense, and it is not fair, and it's definitely not equal because the whole concept of race creates inequalities and on purpose to create this concept of privilege. So let's get into the story, right? But before I start talking about Thomas, we've got to talk about his wife, Martha. Why? Because women's stories are not told. There have been so many stories of men. It's like the great founders of America were all white, wealthy landowners who did it all by themselves, right? And we know that is not true. If you believe that, you wouldn't be in Black history. Let's be honest, right? So I want to start with the story of Martha. Because where are the women, right? We need to know those. One, I want to tell you, we have no real images of Martha. So when you see some pictures of Martha like this, those are not real images, right? The descriptions that we have of Martha has allowed artists to kind of recreate what she may have looked like. All right. What else do I want you to know? I want you to know that Thomas Jefferson did not marry Martha until 23. Right? Martha, at 18 years old, was married to another man who she had a son with. And unfortunately, she became a widow, and her son, her first child, will also pass. She will have 6 children with Thomas Jefferson. Right? At the age of 23, Thomas Jefferson and Martha get married. Right? She moves to Monticello, and she supports Thomas Jefferson. Right? She marries Thomas. He's a lawyer. Then he becomes the member of the House of Burgess. You probably remember all this, right? Like for Albemarle County. He becomes governor of Virginia. She's supporting this. He's writing. He's doing these arguments. He's taking on the British. Well, she's taking on the British too, right? You could not have had an army of the Continental Army buying weapons from places like France without women funding it and finding the money to do it, right? So Martha was part of that movement of women who helped fund the American Revolution. She also seemed to be in love with Thomas, right? Like she would go to Williamsburg when he went to Williamsburg, and when he moved the capital to Richmond to keep it away from the British capturing it, she followed through with him. She also inherited a large amount of property. When her father died, she inherited a lot of money, a lot of acres of land, like 11,000 acres of land, and slaves. She also inherits her own siblings, her half siblings, as property, and I'll get into that in a minute. What else do we know? Within their marriage of 10 years, Martha will pass, and she passes in the 10th year of their marriage because of childbirth. She is 33 years old. She has 6 children in 10 years. I don't know how she did it. Stronger woman than me. I also want you to know this too. Childbirth is the number one killer of women until after World War II. Right. So childbirth and getting pregnant is a very dangerous thing, and it still is today. I mean, there's a lot of complications. How do you probably know Martha? Probably you just have heard of like Martha Jefferson Hospital. Right. Now, the irony in naming it Martha Jefferson, very cool, named after a woman, but she wasn't a nurse. She didn't deal with medicine. That would have been her slaves. That would have been Black people who she owned, taking care of her, helping her with childbirth and raising her children, and also healing her children when they got sick, right? The concept of healing in medicine is actually straight from Africa. Okay. What do we know? We know that after her father dies, she inherits her half brothers and sisters along with other slaves, and their names are on the screen there for you. The oldest of her half siblings is a woman named Sally. Sally moves to Monticello with Thomas Jefferson when she is still a toddler. Right. Sally then is trained to be this housemaid, this servant. She's going to take care of Martha and then Martha's daughters as they grow up. What do we know? We know that Martha's dad had a sexual relationship with Elizabeth Hemings. Elizabeth Hemings is actually biracial. Her mom was a black slave and her dad was a white sea captain. And her dad, there is writing, tried to buy Elizabeth, who's nicknamed Beth, and Sally from their owner, Martha's dad, and he refused. He not only refused, but then he had children with Elizabeth, with Elizabeth Hemings, a slave. Okay, Martha actually just a quick little side note, was actually raised by Elizabeth Hemings, a slave, because her mother died shortly after giving birth to Martha. Right, so Sally Hemings grows up on Jefferson's plantation. Right now, Jefferson owned over 600 slaves, and she got to work, as a domestic servant, as a maid inside the house. Sally Hemings was only a quarter white, right? So her mom is half, so she is her dad is white, and she is then a quarter slave, right? Well, Martha dies in childbirth, is where we left off, and when she dies, Sally starts to take over the role of helping and raising Martha's daughters. And in 1787, when Thomas Jefferson is a minister to France, Thomas Jefferson has Sally accompany his daughter Maria to Paris. He wants Maria to attend school there and to learn there, and Sally attends. And in 2 years, she's speaking French, right? She's fitting in Paris culture. And let me tell you, in France, they were big abolitionists. So they were constantly trying to get Sally to leave Thomas Jefferson and live in Paris, free her from slavery. But she didn't. All right. And the reason why we know she didn't is because she got into this agreement with Thomas Jefferson that if she would return back to Virginia with him and his daughter, that she would work for him, be his slave, but he would have to free her children out of slavery, right? So we know that there's this agreement called extraordinary privileges that she got. Now, other slaves would have never been able to negotiate anything like this, okay? She was able to argue for the freedom of her unborn children. And at the age of 14, she gets into a sexual affair with Thomas Jefferson. Now, he's 44 when this affair starts. So when he's 46, they have their first child. She returns pregnant to Virginia at the age of 16. And the question I always get in class is, Ms. Carlton, is this rape? And I'm going to let you answer that. I will tell you this, like the hundreds of thousands of enslaved women in the U.S. Whose stories are not told had no rights, right? They were seen as property. They were owned by their owners. They could not refuse sexual advances, right? And if they did, there were consequences to that, all right? Also, I want you to know that laws in Virginia changed on purpose because of slavery. Any child now took the inheritance of their mother's status. So if the mother was black or a slave, then the child would be black and a slave. They no longer took the father's, right? The father's inheritance. So in European culture, that never happened, right? So it was always based on your father. So that's why we still take our father's last name. So in Virginia, they purposely changed the laws in order to make sure a class of biracial children are still used as slaves by white owners. So if you look at the screen, you can see kind of this crazy, complex family history that is often not told in the U.S., but it's not just Thomas Jefferson. There's a lot of slave owners. And it was written about in newspapers during these times. So this is not like something people didn't know about, right? And so there, of course, is John, who is Martha's dad, right? And Martha, mom is also named Martha, and she passes, and then he gets in a relationship with Elizabeth. They have children, right? And then those children are inherited by Martha, and they move on Thomas Jefferson's plantation called Monticello. And then there they go. There's Sally having children, and then there's Martha's children with Thomas Jefferson. All right. So as I told you before, look at these. This is not just unique to Thomas Jefferson, right? This hypocrisy of race and racism and this idea of democracy and ownership and how they are always going to be in conflict with each other starts from the very beginning, right? On the picture on the left, you can see Sally Hemings' first son, right? And often some of her children, I think half of her children actually, when they were freed by Thomas Jefferson, moved and integrated into white society. People didn't even know they were Black because, I mean, they are 1/8 white. Like you wouldn't even know that their great grandmother was Black, right? And then if you look on the right, that's a picture from New Orleans. And, New Orleans was started as a city where a lot of slave owners, plantation owners, wealthy white men put their African American mistress to have an affair there, and there's these biracial children that throughout history and this complexity. Even Howard University was helped to be funded by white plantation owners, post Civil War in order to help their biracial children get an education because Black people were denied the basic rights to an education and denied universities forever. So they had to create their own. But you can see the complexities of color in that, right? And that's why we have these crazy stories today where a Black couple will have twins and one will be white and one will be Black. And everybody's like, oh, what happened? Well, because our whole culture has mixed. And we don't tell this story, right? Here's also a very famous drawing done in 1825 before the Civil War on how the hypocrisy of slave masters lived. Right on one hand, there you go, right, in an affair with a Black woman, and then on the right, how he would believe that he owns and owns people, right. Right. There's another picture there. Like it can tell you, I mean, there's so many pictures. If you look at primary sources, even if you do a Google online search, you can find a lot of primary sources of this hypocrisy. On the left, right, classic, right, story of two slaves. And then on the right there, of course, is Thomas Jefferson's family and his lineage, which was denied for a very long time. It was definitely denied in the late 1800s, was denied in the early 1900s. Until 1998, there was a DNA test that proved that Thomas Jefferson did father the children of Sally, and Monticello, of course, agrees with that history. And there is, some other writings about it that prove that Thomas Jefferson was the father of Sally's children. Now, when Thomas Jefferson dies, he lives up to his promise. He frees Sally's children, not Sally, but frees Sally's children. And they go on to do amazing things and overcome their oppression. But Sally then is basically freed by one of Thomas's children, and she goes and lives with her son, where she will move to Albemarle and die later in life. But we do know this is an American hypocrisy. The story of Thomas Jefferson and the complexities of it is not just TJ's own, but we also know that from the beginning of this relationship with Sally and Thomas Jefferson, people are writing about it, they're debating about it, and Thomas Jefferson almost lost the election because of it, right? We know that this is the biggest hypocrisy. How do you write things like Thomas Jefferson did, that Black people are inferior, or you write things like all men are created equal, and then you do the complete opposite, right? And historians have argued whether or not Thomas Jefferson and Sally were in love, and it's hard to prove that, especially because you didn't find any writing between them. But let me tell you, that's going to be a question that you have to think about. I mean, Hollywood has romanticized it. I don't know if Sally was in love, or if Thomas Jefferson was in love, or if it was just abuse of power, because Thomas Jefferson never claimed his children, his black children. Sorry, never claimed his black children. He claimed his white children, and oftentimes he never even referred to them by their first name. So I mean, that's just nuts, right? Because his black children looked like a spitting image of him. All right. So here we are, right? From the very beginning, the complexities of race and American hypocrisy. We are now going to do an activity that I will explain to you after this lecture. Thanks for hanging in there and listening to the whole story.